to Judaism. She also leaves Jerusalem pregnant with Solomon's son, whom she names Menelik. As a young man, Menelik travels to Jerusalem, and Solomon anoints him king, and sends him back with a number of Jewish families. During their journey, Menelik finds that some of these Israelite immigrants have taken the Ark of the Covenant with them. So Ethiopia understood itself as the new Israel, not only in the spiritual sense, but also in the political, and even biological sense. Its kings were descendants of Solomon. The Church of the East. While many bishops from Egypt returned home from the Council of Chalcedon disappointed, or perhaps aghast, the bishops from Syria returned home delighted by the two natures decision about Christ. Ultimately, however, most of them would also reject Chalcedon. How this came about is something of a strange story. The theological battle waged initially at the Council of Ephesus and later at Chalcedon could be simplified to the fight between those who followed Cyril of Alexandria, and those who followed Nestorius, the Archbishop of Constantinople, who was deposed at Ephesus. Cyril had emphasized the unity of Christ to such a degree that he could be interpreted as having blurred Jesus' distinct natures, or at least as having reduced his human nature as inconsequential, the monophysite view. Nestorius, on the other hand, had emphasized the distinctions between Jesus' natures so strongly that he was interpreted as denying the unity of the person of Christ. Cyril represented the Alexandrian school of thought, while Nestorius represented the Antiochian. The two sides, Alexandrian and Antiochian, could not have been further apart on this issue. Ephesus and Chalcedon affirmed Cyril's Christology, but only insofar as it could be interpreted along Chalcedon's line, two separate natures in one single person. Many of Cyril's interpreters understood Chalcedon as rejecting Cyril. One of the great articulators of the Antiochian school was Theodore of Mopsuestia. So revered was Theodore that he became known in Syrian Christianity as the interpreter, that is, the great articulator of scripture and authentic Christian faith. Theodore died widely respected, but his reputation suffered greatly as his writings were increasingly appealed to by Nestorians. This trend created a rift between representatives of the imperial church and many Syrian and Persian Christians, who considered Theodore one of the great theologians of the church. The eventual separation between the Syriac-speaking church and the imperial church became even more oddly strained when the Patriarch of Antioch, Severus, R. 512-518, defended a monophysite interpretation of Cyril's teaching, and tried to sway those under his leadership to the Coptic monophysite position, a position the imperial church was sure he had never really held. Now there were Christians of various theological commitments in the Middle East. Those who followed Chalcedon came to be called Melkites, from the Syriac word for emperor, and Marionites, after the influential monk Mara. Monophysites were called Jacobites, following Jacob Baradius, the great 6th century bishop of Edessa, and those who followed Nestorius became the Church of the East. In 489, the Emperor Zeno tried to end all divisions, and insist that all Christians embrace Chalcedon's decisions. He drove out all the teachers and public supporters of Theodore of Mopsuestia from Edessa, a theological center at the edge of the Roman Empire. They settled in Nisibis in the Persian Empire. This school became perhaps the key theological resource for the Church of the East. The Jacobites, like the Copts of Egypt, created their own separate church and lines of authority. The Syrian church, however, continued to see itself as part of the larger church. Initially, the Christians of the Persian Empire were under the jurisdiction of the Patriarch of Antioch. In 424, however, Persian bishops declared that they had their own jurisdiction. They would be in communion with Constantinople, but insisted on their own patriarch, whom they called the Catholicos of the East. The Roman Emperor agreed, and recognized their independent authority. Their communion with the imperial church would not last. By embracing Nestorianism, and due to their political separation from the Roman Empire, they ultimately became a separate Christian community. One ought not to downplay the importance of these Christians, who sometimes fall off the map of Western Christian consciousness. The Church of the East spread across the Middle East, and today reflects the principal form of Christianity in southeastern Turkey, Azerbaijan, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Afghanistan. The Church of the East is also responsible for the development of Christianity in India, Sri Lanka, and China. Tradition has it that the Apostle Thomas brought Christianity to India in the 1st century. The story of Thomas's missionary journey is found in the Acts of Thomas, a Syriac text from the 3rd or 4th century. As the story goes, the risen Jesus appeared to Thomas in a dream, and told him to evangelize the peoples of India. Shortly afterward, Thomas met a merchant from India with orders from King Gandhar of Punjab to bring back architects to build his royal palace. Thomas agreed to the job, and travelled to India. When Thomas saw the severe poverty of the people, however, he took the king's money, and used it to alleviate their suffering. When the king discovered this, he was outraged, and unswayed by Thomas's defense. The king then received a vision, in which he saw his royal palace in heaven. This led to his conversion to Christianity. Thomas continued to evangelize the Indian population until he was martyred in what is now the city of Chennai. That the Apostle Thomas would have impressed this agent of the Indian king as a magnificent architect stretches the imagination. Other accounts have the first evangelization of India beginning with the Apostle Bartholomew. Whatever the case, there seems to have been some Christian presence in the region early. In Eusebius's ecclesiastical history he says that a Christian philosopher travelled to India in the late 2nd century, and discovered Christians already living there. They even possessed the Gospel of Matthew in Aramaic. Roman trade with India had already been established in the ancient period. Of particular interest was the Roman delight of pepper. Trade routes were established along the Silk Road, as well as by sea around the Horn of Africa. By the Church of the East 153. Late 3rd century Christians had a network of churches throughout Persia, and around the Indian Ocean. David, the 3rd Metropolitan of Basra, made a journey to India around the year 300, and visited Christian communities in both the north and south. Thanks to the Church of the East, Christianity also arrived in China in the 6th century, and enjoyed a well-established presence by the 8th. At the time, the Tiang dynasty had diplomatic and trade relations with the Persian Empire, and politically controlled Manchuria, Northern Korea, Mongolia, and Tibet. Christians appeared in the capital city, modern Xi'an, sometime in the early to mid-7th century. In an imperial decree we find the following. The Persian monk Pen has come from afar bringing scriptures and teaching. The meaning of the teaching has been carefully examined. It is mysterious, wonderful, calm. It fixes the essentials of life and perfection. It is the salvation of living beings. It is the wealth of man. It is right that it should spread through the empire. Therefore let the local officials build a monastery in the Eining quarter with 21 regular monks. One the most impressive documentation of Christianity in China is an enormous black limestone monument discovered in the 17th century on the precincts of a temple close to Xi'an. Erected in 781, it contains 1,700 Chinese characters interspersed with Syriac words. This monument offers a short account of Christian missions to China, including those of the Christian monk Pen from Persia. It mentions a number of texts of the Christian canon, liturgical rites, and even rules for monks. Another fascinating discovery detailing the presence of Christianity in China comes from a set of documents discovered in the 19th century in a walled-up chapel. These writings came from Chinese Christian monks, and many were Chinese translations of Syrian texts, including a text called Jesus Messiah Sutra that contains the basic teachings of Christianity. Portion of the text on the Nestorian stele. Behold the unchangeably true and invisible, who existed through all eternity without origin, the far-seeing perfect intelligence, whose mysterious existence is everlasting. Operating on primordial substance he created the universe, being more excellent than all holy intelligences, inasmuch as he is the source of all that is honorable. This is our eternal true Lord God, triune and mysterious in substance. He appointed the cross as the means for determining the 4 cardinal points. He moved the original spirit, and produced the 2 principles of nature. The summer void was changed, and heaven and earth were opened out. The sun and moon revolved, and day and night commenced. Having perfected all inferior objects, he then made the first man. Upon him he bestowed an excellent disposition, giving him in charge the government of all created beings. Man, acting out the original principles of his nature, was pure and unostentatious. His unsullied and expansive mind was free from the least inordinate desire, until Satan introduced the seeds of falsehood, to deteriorate his purity of principle. Thereupon, our Trinity being divided in nature, the illustrious and honorable Messiah, veiling his true dignity, appeared in the world as a man. Angelic powers promulgated the glad tidings. A virgin gave birth to the Holy One in Syria. A bright star announced the felicitous event, and Persians observing the splendor came to present tribute. The ancient dispensation, as declared by the 24 holy men, the writers of the Old Testament, was then fulfilled, and he laid down great principles for government of families and kingdoms. He established the new religion of the silent operation of the pure spirit of the triune. He rendered virtue subservient to direct faith. He fixed the extent of the 8 boundaries, thus completing the truth and freeing it from dross. He opened the gate of the 3 constant principles, introducing life and destroying death. He suspended the bright sun to invade the chambers of darkness, and the falsehoods of the devil were thereupon defeated. He set in motion the vessel of mercy by which to ascend to the bright mansions, whereupon rational beings were then released. Having thus completed the manifestation of his power, in clear day he ascended to his true station. 2. Christianity was not to last in China. Monasteries were dependent on the favor of Chinese rulers, and by the 9th century this favor was removed. Monasteries and churches were suppressed, and by the end of the 10th century the church was for all intents and purposes extinct. Expansion of the Byzantine Church. Armenia and Georgia. Iberia. Armenia is a territory that borders the western part of the Caspian Sea, the northern part of Iraq, and the border of Turkey. In the Christian era it was divided into 3 geographical areas. The west was part of the Roman Empire, the east was part of the Persian Empire, and the south was banded between the two for several centuries. Eusebius's ecclesiastical history has Christianity reaching Armenia by the beginning of the 4th century, though it is unclear how. Traditionally, the conversion of the Armenian people at large to Christianity is credited to Gregory, the Illuminator, who came from an Armenian noble family. Gregory's father had been executed for assassinating the king, and Gregory had been banished to Caesarea in Asia Minor. There he was brought up in the Christian faith. Upon returning to Armenia, he worked his way up to becoming secretary to King Tiridates Roman 3, d. 330, but he refused to worship Anahit, the goddess venerated by the Armenians. The king imprisoned him for 10 years, and upon his release he miraculously healed the ailing king, who subsequently had his court convert to Christianity. Gregory returned to Caesarea, and was consecrated bishop. He then baptized the king, and masses of his subjects in the Euphrates River. After Tiridates' baptism, he destroyed all pagan shrines, and built churches throughout his kingdom. In the early decades, the language of the scriptures and liturgy used in Armenia was either Syriac or Greek, because the native Armenian language had no formal script. Later, the Armenian monk Mashtots created a script, and had the scriptures translated into what was the first Armenian text ever produced. Tradition has it that Mashtots was received by the Armenians like Moses descending from Mount Sinai with the law. Within 100 years Armenian monasticism was so developed that many monks migrated to the Holy Land east of Jerusalem, where Armenian Christianity still has a presence. When the controversy of Chalcedon broke out in the Armenian Church, some of which was located in the Persian Empire, Armenian Christians readily aligned with the theology of Theodore of Mopsuestia and, by extension, Nestorius. Sahak, the great-grandson of Gregory the Illuminator, was the Catholicos, premier bishop, of Armenia from 387 to 438, and was responsible for establishing an Armenian liturgy. His episcopal see was in Win10, a city ruled by the Persians. Ultimately, Sahak aligned himself with Galston's decision, and its denunciation of Nestorius. This brought down the wrath of the Persian authorities, who saw it as nothing short of aligning with the Roman Empire. The Persians tried to limit contacts and influence between the Armenians and Greek-speaking Christians of the Roman Empire, and to undermine the church in Armenia, ultimately demanding that all its citizens become Zoroastrian, the official religion of the Persian Empire. Sahak was executed. The persecution would not last, and Armenian Christianity survived. In the 6th century the Armenian bishops ultimately rejected both the Council of Chalcedon and Nestorianism, the latter of which had by then been implanted in the Church of the East. The conversion of Georgia is strikingly like that of Armenia, both in its history of a saintly healer, and in Christianity's creation of a literate culture. Georgia sits south of the Caucasus Mountains, east of the Black Sea, and west of the Caspian Sea. The western part of Georgia had been under the influence of the Roman Empire since the 1st century, and the Emperor Nero annexed this region in the 1st century, making it part of the province of Cappadocia in Asia Minor. Late in the 3rd century, Christianity made inroads into the territory, and the Council of Nicaea even included 2 bishops from the region. The conversion of the eastern part of the country, at this time an independent kingdom of Iberia, came about because of a Christian woman, Nino, who had been taken captive as a slave. Nino had a great reputation among the people as a saintly woman with a strange religion. She lived a life of asceticism and constant prayer. She also had the reputation of being able to heal. When Queen Anna became ill, Nino was brought to her and healed her in the name of Christ. The delighted King Miriam was grateful and wanted to offer her gifts, but the now healed queen told him that Nino would have nothing to do with material wealth. Nino only wished that the royal household would worship Christ. Days later, the king became lost in the forest and called on Christ to rescue him. When he found his way back to the city, he insisted that Nino instruct him and the queen in the Christian faith. He then sent an embassy to Emperor Constantine asking for Christian officials to build a church and convert the people. Soon a bishopric was created in the capital city of Tuskegee. Like Armenia, Georgia did not have its own alphabet, so Christian leaders created one in order to pass along the scriptures and liturgy. This became the foundation for independent literature to develop in the Georgian culture. While the Armenians at large rejected the Council of Chalcedon, the Georgians fully embraced it, thus creating an alliance with the imperial church. This alliance was formalized by the Georgian king Vakhtang d. 522 and the emperor Zeno. Zeno recognized the Georgian church as independent, though under the jurisdiction of the Patriarch of Antioch. By the 7th century, however, the Georgians had become completely independent juridically, even as they remained in communion with the church at large. Slavic lands from the 5th century onward, various groups of Indo-European Slavic peoples began to migrate into southern Russia, Hungary, Moravia, and the Balkans. In 862, Rostislav, the king of Moravia, asked Emperor Michael Roman III to send missionaries to his kingdom, and Michael chose 2 brothers from Thessalonica, Greece, Cyril and Methodius. Some Slavs had migrated as far as southern Greece, and Cyril and Methodius were fluent in their tongue. Methodius also might have spent time in the Balkans. Both men were classically educated, and known to be pious. As in Armenia and Georgia, the first task for these brothers was to translate Christian teaching and scriptures into the Slavic tongue. They had to actually create an alphabet to write it down. This alphabet, based on Greek letters, developed into what is called the Cyrillic script, and was adopted by the Slavic peoples living among the Rus, Serbians, and Bulgarians. Actually, Christianity was already being practiced in Moravia, Slovakia, as a result of the influence of the Germanic Franks, many of whom were Christian. But King Rostislav wanted a Christian faith in the Slavic tongue, and the Frankish priests did not adapt well to the Slavic language. Rostislav's principal concern was to train his own Slavic clergy, and to create a Slavic church. The issue was also political. By now, the West was creating a competing Christianity, one centered on Rome, and a Western empire that competed with the Byzantine Empire. Becoming Christian involved not merely embracing the faith, but also deciding which community to align with, the Latin West or the Greek East. Rostislav very well may have initially wanted to create an alliance with Constantinople, creating a political bond that would provide powerful supporters against the German kingdom. On the other hand, choosing to embrace a Latin Christianity rather than a Greek one could also allow for Western alliances. From the middle of the 9th century on, the Franks began to claim territory to their east, particularly Moravia and Bohemia, today's eastern half of the Czech Republic, and western half of the Slovak Republic. Both the Moravians and Bohemians saw that there was more to be gained by political ties with their neighboring German kingdom than with Constantinople, which was far to the east. Thus they both accepted ties to the Latin Church. Subsequent to Bohemia's conversion to Christianity, the faith entered Poland. Mieszko, a Polish prince, became king in 960, and in 964 he entered into a marriage with Dobrawa, the daughter of the Bohemian king Boleslav. Clearly, this was a dynastic marriage intended to cement ties between these two countries as a way of checking the expansionistic designs of the Germans. Dobrawa came to Poland accompanied by Western priests and a Latin Christian faith. In 968, Pope John Roman XIII commissioned Jordan, the first bishop of Poland. Russian faith in the early 9th century Rus merchants journeyed to Constantinople to open up trade. They were overwhelmed by the wealth of the city, and returned with tales of its opulence. In 860, a fleet of 200 Rus ships attacked the city, which had been left defenseless as the empire's fleets fought the Arabs. Ultimately the siege ended quickly and unsuccessfully, and ambassadors from Constantinople went to Kiev and arranged a peace treaty. In the middle of the 10th century, Olga, the widow of the Rus Prince Oleg, journeyed to Constantinople. Like the traders a century before, Olga was taken by the city, its art, architecture, and culture. Further, the emperor treated her visit with great pomp and ceremony. He urged her to be baptized. She consented, and returned to Kiev a Christian. While her son Sviatoslav had no interest in Christianity, her grandson Vladimir, who became ruler in 980, did embrace the faith. But Vladimir's conversion was not religiously tidy. He attacked Cherson, a Byzantine city in Crimea on the northern shore of the Black Sea, and cut off the city's water supply. He then demanded of Emperor Basil Roman II that he give his sister to Vladimir in marriage. Basil objected on the grounds that a Christian should not marry a pagan, but he assured Vladimir that he would arrange the marriage if Vladimir consented to be baptized. Vladimir agreed, and, upon baptism and his marriage, he had the people of Kiev baptized in the Dnieper River. The Rus became part of Constantinople's Commonwealth, which brought not only a solidification of a common faith, but also higher culture and developing trade relationships with Constantinople. While Vladimir's decision to become Christian was initially tied to political and economic factors, his subsequent Christian faith appears neither fraudulent nor superficial. Once baptized, He worked energetically for decades to bring the Christian faith to his people. He built churches, set up bishoprics, and promoted the Slavic language and Christian literary culture. His kingdom inaugurated a new era in the history of Christianity, and ultimately would become larger than the Byzantine Empire itself. The Russian Church was centered in Kiev, Ukraine, whose archbishop was the metropolitan for all the Rus people, but this would not last. Mongol armies under Genghis Khan, c. 1162-1227, fought the Rus in numerous battles, two of which, 1223 and 1238, subjected them to Mongol rule. The metropolitan center of Russian Orthodoxy moved to Moscow, and in 1448 a council of Russian bishops declared itself independent of Constantinople. By 1589, Moscow had become a patriarchal see. Despite the fact that the Rus people were controlled by the Mongolian Empire, religious toleration was typical, and monasteries flourished as centers of mission work, scholarship, and spirituality. Christianity continued to spread, even among the Mongol upper class. When Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, the Russian Orthodox Church imagined itself the Third Rome. Just as Rome had been the initial center of the empire, and Constantinople its successor, now the Russian people began to believe that they were destined to take on the ancient mantle. Initially this was more of a religious proclamation of authority and independence, and something of a conceit, but it would soon take on political significance. During the reign of Ivan Roman III of Russia, 1440-1505, the Mongols were defeated at the Battle of the Ugra River in 1408, and Russia emerged as a dominant power. Ivan had married Sophia Paleolog, the niece of Constantine Roman XI, the last Byzantine emperor. This link allowed Ivan to consider himself the successor to Constantinople. Soon Russians regularly referred to their leader as Tsar, a Russian term for Caesar, or emperor. Conversions from the top down today, we tend to think of religious faith as highly personal and individualistic. Indeed, in early Christianity it was certainly that. The faith was technically outlawed, and seekers had to enter the church in a modestly clandestine manner. They were personally instructed, and tested even before becoming catechumens. They then went through a rather rigorous process of initiation, culminating in baptism. Expectations were high, and embracing the faith was a morally costly venture. The logic of the Roman Empire was that embracing, at least minimally, the religion of the empire, with its gods and emperor worship, constituted loyalty to the empire. It was a sign of patriotism. Since Christians did not participate, they were outliers. As Christianity became identified as the religion of the Roman Empire, increasingly persons wanted to join the church for social and economic reasons. Still, membership was imagined to be an individual decision, though now one with possibly mixed motives. The conversions of peoples outside the natural boundaries of the empire, however, changed the church's course. Many of these peoples, be they various Germanic tribes or Slavic countries, shared the same initial values of the Roman Empire. To be of one religion showed patriotism and loyalty. Thus, with the conversion of the rulers, whole swaths of their citizens were expected to take on the new faith. No longer were individuals discreetly initiated over a long period of scrutiny and training. Now, once the monarch became Christian, it was expected that others would follow suit in short order. Further, because there was simply no sense of separation of church and state, government funding for the faith facilitated its quick expansion. Bishops or their representative priests baptized people en masse, often thousands at a time. Instead of preparing them for baptism, it was assumed that they would take on the faith more deeply as they attended Eucharist, heard sermons, and were affected by the laws and values of the Church. This change from individual conversions to mass baptisms cannot be overestimated. The degree to which most citizens became authentically Christian would have to happen throughout their lifetime, or over the next several generations. The surging of Islam. Muhammad, 570-632, was born into a leading tribe of Mecca, the Quraysh. His father died about the time he was born, and his mother when he was 6. After 2 years of being cared for by his grandfather, he was adopted by his uncle, and worked minding the family's flocks. In early adulthood he took up the caravan business, and entered the service of Khadija, a wealthy widow, whom he eventually married. From 610 on, Muhammad began to receive revelations from God that led to his creation of a new religion, Islam, one grounded in Jewish and Christian theological impulses. Muhammad and his followers were persecuted in Mecca, and immigrated to Medina, where he became the civil and religious leader. Ultimately, after several battles with the Meccans, he established a unified religious and political order in the Arabian Peninsula. Following Muhammad's death, Abu Bakr was controversially designated as the new caliph, or successor to Muhammad. Bakr only ruled for 2 years, but in that brief time he launched a series of military campaigns into both the Byzantine and Persian empires. The Byzantine army was weak at the time, and was made up of Arab auxiliaries, who regularly defected. After Damascus was taken, Emperor Heraclius gathered a huge force to confront the Muslim invaders. The decisive battle was at the Yarmouk River, just north of the Sea of Galilee. The Byzantine army was crushed even though they vastly outnumbered the Muslims. Jerusalem resisted on its own, but after a long siege the Patriarch, Sophronius, negotiated terms for surrender. This conquest was particularly shocking to the Christian imagination. Since the 4th century, when its population reached 50,000, Jerusalem had been a great place of pilgrimage and veneration. It was the center of the Holy Land, the place where Christ had been crucified and rose from the dead. Christians saw themselves as supersessionists, that is, their religion superseded Judaism, with Christ the fulfillment of all its promises. While Paul did not imagine his faith as a separate religion from Judaism, he did teach that the Jewish law was merely a disciplinarian waiting for Christ's fulfillment. In short, the Christian dispensation eclipsed the foundations of the Jewish faith. The New Testament's letter to the Hebrews speaks to Christians on this score. Jesus, it says, brought a new covenant, making the first one obsolete. 8:13. Jerusalem symbolized the superseding of Judaism by Christianity. In a like manner, Islam saw itself as superseding Christianity. Muhammad and his followers thought his revelations corrected what was wrong with Christianity, and portrayed Jesus as a prophet anticipating Muhammad. Islam saw itself as the fulfillment of the religion of the patriarchs, and the inheritor of God's promises to Abraham. Further, Muhammad had experienced a supernatural flight into heaven, al-Miraj, from Jerusalem's Temple Mount. In short, Jerusalem was their holy city, third only to Mecca and Medina. The spread of Islam, both east and west, was unimaginably rapid. By 640, the Caliphate had extended into Mesopotamia, Syria, and Palestine. By 642, it had taken Egypt, and by 643 much of the Persian Empire. From this point on, three of the ancient patriarchal sees, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria, were in Muslim hands, and no longer held theological prominence in the larger Christian world. The Umayyad Caliphate, 661-750, based in Damascus, moved westward along the North African coast, and into Spain. It was not until Charles Martel led the Franks in a counterattack at the Battle of Tours in 732 that Muslim expansion in Europe subsided. Before the end of the 7th century, however, Muslims had conquered Armenia, Persia, Syria, Palestine, Iraq, North Africa, and Spain. With lightning speed, Islam rewrote the map of the Roman Empire, and came to dominate areas that had been part of the Christian civilization for centuries. By and large, the Muslim takeover of Christian cities left their religious life relatively intact. Mosques were built, of course, and non-Muslims were forced to pay additional taxes and obey the new civil laws, but Christian worship remained the same. Christians, and others, carried out their affairs relatively independently. This freedom, however, would not last entirely. Christians were often restricted, and even controlled by their new Arab overlords. The Muslim governor in Alexandria, for example, insisted on playing a role in the election of bishops, and even the patriarch. Coptic was soon replaced with Arabic, except in church liturgies. As the press of Islamic invaders turned to North Africa, many leading Christian civil leaders and intellectuals fled to Europe. The North African Church, once led by the likes of Cyprian of Carthage and Augustine of Hippo, would soon find itself losing its Latin language and intellectual heritage. By the 12th century, North Africa was almost completely Muslim. Even in the most tolerant and progressive Muslim kingdom of Cordoba, Spain, Christians were not allowed to build churches or make any public display of their faith. Further, if a Christian woman married a Muslim man, she was forced by civil law to become Muslim, as were their children. It would not be until the 12th century that Muslims would constitute a majority in Spain, but this certainly did not mean that Christians had much political or cultural power. Islam's political and religious developments were fraught with internal strife. When Muhammad died, his followers disagreed as to who ought to replace him as leader. Some believed that what singularly mattered was a respected leader of pious faith. Others argued for one from Muhammad's own family line. While Abu Bakr was chosen by the majority of Muslim leaders, he was not of Muhammad's bloodline. Those who insisted on a blood relative of Muhammad chose Ali, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, to succeed him. Conflict followed, with both of Bakr's next two successors as caliph, El-Imam, R. 634-644, and Uthman, R. 644-656, being murdered. Upon Uthman's murder, Ali was chosen as the fourth caliph. Though this was over the objections of militant members of the Umayyad clan, to which Uthman belonged. With the support of Muawiyah, the governor of Syria, the Umayyads, particularly because they believed that Ali was implicated in Uthman's death, fought Ali's forces. During a battle in 657, a truce was called between Ali's forces and Uthman's supporters. They agreed to arbitration on the question of an authentic caliph. While one might consider the question of who had the right to take on Muhammad's mantle to be purely religious, it was also sociological. Those who supported the Umayyad clan were members of the Meccan elite, many of whom were relatively late converts. Their choice of caliph was driven by pragmatic beliefs about who would be the most effective leader. Those who insisted on a caliph from Muhammad's family were early believers, who had suffered from Meccan persecutions that had forced them to flee to Medina for their lives. The settlement did not last long, and many believed that Ali had capitulated, compromising the very faith of Islam. Some initial supporters of Ali, the Kharijites, literally those who withdraw, assassinated Ali in 661. Those who aligned with the Umayyad dynasty became known as Sunni, right path, Muslims, while those who aligned with Ali became known as Shia, partisans of Ali, Muslims. Sunni leaders placed their capital in Damascus, Syria. Shiite leaders elected as Caliph Ali's son Hussein, who led a revolt against the Umayyads in 680. In 750, with Shiite support, a branch headed by members of Muhammad's family created its own dynasty in Iraq, and its caliphate came to be known as the Abbasid dynasty. Both dynasties flourished. The Umayyads spread their power to Spain, creating a great center of learning in its capital of Cordoba. The Abbasid dynasty survived for 500 years until it collapsed in 1258 from the impact of Mongol invaders. For both dynasties, these centuries would constitute the golden age for Islam. Islamic art, architecture, science, medicine, and learning flourished from Baghdad to Cordoba. Baghdad was perhaps the greatest center of scholarship in the world, and Cordoba was a particular center of interreligious learning among Muslims, Druze, and Christians. Much of the West's understanding of geography, mathematics, and astronomy has its foundation in Islamic scholarship. Even Christian medieval theology was influenced by philosophical and theological discussions advanced by Muslim scholars. Of particular importance was the rediscovery of Aristotle. Recall that early Christian intellectuals used Plato's philosophy to make their own theological projects intellectually rigorous. Aristotle, Plato's favorite student, and his works were seemingly uninteresting to early Christian thinkers. Apart from Aristotle's texts on logic, he was simply forgotten. The Islamic world, however, took a great interest in Aristotle, and many of his works were preserved in Arabic. Islamic writers, such as Ibn Sina, Latinized to Avicenna, developed a philosophically robust approach to Islamic theology using Aristotle's thought. This combination of Greek philosophy and Islamic scholarship was further advanced by Ibn Rushd, known among the Latins as Averroes. Christians in Spain began to translate Aristotle's works into Latin, making them available to medieval thinkers. Ironically, The relative collapse of much of the Christian Roman Empire provided the conditions for the possibility of a great surge and advancement in Western scholarship. At conclusions between the 5th and 10th centuries, Christianity expanded massively. Due to the reaction of the decisions of Chalcedon, however, it was not a unified faith. But this seeming liability also allowed for it to exist peacefully in lands that were in conflict with the Byzantine Empire. From Syria to Persia to Ethiopia, Christianity not only held its own, but grew and generated missions to the Far East. In Eastern European and Slavic territories, the Christian faith became the dominant religion. Christianity would not fare all that well against the spread of Islam. The northern coasts of Africa, the home of great leaders, such as Cyril and Athanasius of Alexandria, Cyprian of Carthage, and Augustine of Hippo, would lose their Christian faith. The Middle Eastern Church did better, but it nonetheless became a marginalized religion. In the early 21st century, with the disruption of Egypt, Iraq, and Syria, Christians would suffer even more. Summary questions. The Council of Chalcedon proved to be a watershed council for the Church. List where each church fell regarding its decisions. What was the political fallout over its conclusions? What are the similarities and differences between the conversions of the Armenians and the Georgians? What is the main division in early Islam, and what was its cause? What was the impact of the rise of Islam on previously Christian-dominated civilizations? The Slavic king Vladimir's conversion was intertwined with political issues. What were they? Are there any other figures who bear resemblance to him in combining religious and political concerns? Discussion questions. What is your reaction to the story of Thomas's journey to convert India? Which parts do you think are historically factual, and which parts mythic? Does it matter, and why? Read the box with some of the text of the Nestorian style. Christianity is depicted in a way that looks foreign to its usual expression. Do you think it represented the authentic Christian tradition, or deviated from it? Explain. This chapter discussed the practice of mass conversions. Do you think these were, at the time, legitimate or illegitimate? Why or why not? KEY terms. Cyril Justinian Muhammad ibn Rushd, Averroes, Methodius Vladimir ibn Sina, Avicenna. Bibliography. Browning, Robert. 1987. Justinian and Theodora. London. Thames and Hudson. College, Marcia. 1997. Medieval Foundations of the Western Intellectual Tradition, 400-1400. New Haven, CT. Yale University Press. Collins, Roger. 1995. Early Medieval Spain. New York. St. Martin's Press. Crone, Patricia. 2004. God's Rule. Government and Islam. 6 Centuries of Medieval Islamic Political Thought. New York. Columbia University Press. Esposito, John. 1998. Islam. The Straight Path, 3rd ed. New York. Oxford University Press. Gregory, Timothy. 2010. A History of Byzantium. Oxford. Wiley Blackwell. Griffith, Sydney. 2008. The Church in the Shadow of the Mosque. Christians and Muslims in the World of Islam. Princeton, NJ. Princeton LLN University Press. McCulloch, Pyramid. 2009. Christianity. The First 3,000 Years. New York. Penguin. Raman, Fazler. 1979. Islam, Second ed. Chicago. University of Chicago Press. Rolls, Richard. 1999. Religions of the Silk Road. Overland trade and cultural exchange from antiquity to the 15th century. New York. St. Mary's Press. Wilken, Robert. 1992. The Land Called Holy. Palestine in Christian History and Thought. New Haven, CT. Yale University Press. Wilken, Robert. 2012. The First 1,000 Years. A Global History of Christians. New Haven, CT. Yale University Press. Notes 1. Cited in Wilken, First 1,000 Years, 241-242. 2. Accessed at http in wikisource.org/wiki/Nestoy and Steele.